fine art and architecture. His students have benefited from his practical experience as a senior planner at Rand Mines, and then, as with a lot of the professional faculties, working concurrently as a partner in architectural practice whilst lecturing at UCT. The practical experience has ranged from private houses to counselling centres in Khayelitsha, and a high-density housing project where he was awarded first prize in the Motherwell Affordable High-Density Housing International competition. And there are further awards, which include the Gold Medal of Distinction issued by the South African Institute of Architects, honorary membership of the Urban Design Institute, and he was asked to give the inaugural lecture for in memory of Roelof Eyten-Beauregard. And as if this is not enough, Julian has done 2 5-year stints as editor of Architecture Essay, the journal of the South African Institute of Architecture, in which he has also published extensively. He was also the general editor of a book, Violence Prevention Through Urban Upgrading, a manual for safety as a public good, a wonderful contribution to making SA a better place for us all. And now it is indeed my privilege to learn about Japanese architecture from an expert in the field. Thank you, Julian.
Thank you very much, Tessa. Can you all hear me all right? Yeah. I'm not at all an expert on Japanese architecture. Louder. I'm not at all an expert on Japanese architecture. As Tessa said, I was. I was stimulated to do this series really from 3 trips to Japan, one over 30 years ago, and then 2 more in the last 2 years. And I wanted to do it firstly simply because I'm fascinated by the architecture of a culture so different from mine. And secondly, I'm intrigued by the way traditional ideas in Japan have come through into the work of some contemporary architects, which is really what I'm exploring in these 5 lectures. That seeping through of traditional ideas is not a common occurrence in today's world, and I see it as a counter or a critique of 2 distinctive trends now long-lived in the architecture and urbanism of global capitalism. The first I call dumbing down. Somehow the mixture of profit as the sole criterion of value with ease and speed of communication dumbs down every detail of our culture, from the way we clap to the way you express your delight, and you'll see lots of it in the tennis, like, to the way that architecture is made and cities are built. And it's all reduced to a kind of lowest common denominator. And I think that that reduces in the city the wonderful richness and diversity that there is around the world. The second trend is what I call shallow novelty. Information technology has generated a climate of immediacy. You're required to answer, to respond, to invent, to create everything immediately and brilliantly. Otherwise, you'll not be heard or noticed in all the dreary sameness. Global capitalism generates a huge demand for novel images to help commodities attract big markets. And they are wanted fast. Brilliant ideas produced at speed are, I think, by definition, shallow. That doesn't really matter with toothpaste or footwear fashion, but buildings aren't commodities like shoes. They're big and long-lasting and record our history and culture and beliefs in many ways better than anything else, better than literature or painting or anything. And they obviously affect many people's lives. Oh, I should be moving on. Is that sharp? Okay. Okay, some of them are sharper than others. This, in fact, is a picture of dumbing down of cities. And I don't know, can you recognize any of these cities? Well, you know, the one on the top left is Johannesburg. And guess what the one below that is? London. Yeah. And the one on the right's Atlanta, right on the right bottom, and the one above that is Osaka in Japan. These are the kind of what I call shallow pieces of brilliance that are littering the cities now. And to litter them like this with these extravagant gestures, which are really aimed to sell either the architect's ego or a brand of a product or a corporation's exclusive feeling of power, to me is very problematic. It reduces the coherence of the city as a whole, and it means that we're surrounded by large and often aggressive buildings, shallow in meaning, that force themselves on us. Then there's this very interesting thing that happens when you have a mass of shallow and novel things all together, and I don't know if you know that, but these are all in London. When they all come together, what you have is what can only be described as a disorderly and confusing sameness. So, as opposed to the reductiveness that there is in this globalization, I'm arguing for local culture, local architecture and city design that will counter this loss of richness and depth and sense of identity. There are two main dangers in such an approach. On the one hand, and it's the top left-hand picture, a very superficial use of local traditions which generates this kind of pastiche and constitutes merely another kind of advertising. And the other, obviously, is nationalism, exclusivity, as produced in fascist Italy or Stalinist Russia, and I expect could easily emerge from Brexit Britain and Trumpist America, where traditions are hardened, as it were, into weapons. We obviously want to steer clear of those two. So I'm arguing for something like what happened in the early 1900s when people like Mussorgsky sought out the rhythms and melodies of folk songs that had been sung for centuries and blended them into their symphonies and concertos. Or like South African jazz, which owes so much to the United States, but also has its own sound and character derived from our history. Or architecturally, like, for example, a man called Rafael Moneo, who in a town hall building in Murcia in Spain, integrates many of the traditional ideas and devices of the buildings of its neighborhood to make a building that's absolutely new but lies positively and comfortably among all those existing buildings. So I'm interested in how deep traditions in architecture seep through into contemporary work in a way that sustains local identity, but not exclusively. It also makes a contribution to the world. Now, I've structured the first three lectures around what I consider to be the three main ideas or characteristics of Japanese architecture, that it's very closely connected with an approach to nature, that is often characterized by a journey through a number of distinct layers towards a secret or hidden center, and that it has a consistent quality of a kind of incompleteness or emptiness, combined, somewhat paradoxically, with meticulous perfection. And then in the last two lectures, I look at the work of some prominent contemporary architects for signs of traditional ideas. So today I'm starting with a brief comparison to give some context for this thinking about Japanese architecture, a brief comparison between a tradition in the West, say that of Italy, and Italy simply because so much of European architecture, Western architecture, comes through or went to Italy, and comparing that with the architecture in Japan in relation to this approach to nature. And what I'm going to try and show is that over the centuries in Japan, in Italy, architects aimed to design buildings which had a rationale that was tied to what they saw as the eternal truths that lie behind nature as we perceive it. So, from the beginning of the Roman era, they were looking to connect with and to represent the laws that are in nature, most convincingly expressed in mathematics. And then by the Renaissance, this was closely linked with the creator or ruler of nature, the one God, perfect and immutable. And also with the idea of man as made in the image of God, i.e. in perfect proportions defined mathematically. In Japan, by contrast, buildings were aimed to be like nature as we experience it with our senses, with the nature that changes all the time over many cycles, with nature that is fresh and blossoming and that grows old. And they were also aimed to be continuous and harmonious with nature and were seen as precious in the way that nature is precious. Now, if you were to ask me to show you a building which epitomizes Italian religious architecture, and profane too, I would choose Sant'Andrea in Mantua by Andrea Palladio. By Alberti. And I would choose it because its architect, Alberti, was the great theoretician of the early Renaissance, whose influence, it's said, persisted for 4 centuries. And seeing that his thinking was based on the thinking of a 2nd century Roman architect, Vitruvius, you could say that roughly it covered the whole Italian tradition from the beginning until early modernism. Now, if you look at this building, what is Alberti doing here? He's doing 2 things. He says that beauty exists in a painting or a building where nothing can be added or subtracted or changed without spoiling it. So he's seeking an absolute perfection that is so complete and resolved that it's timeless. How does he do this? By using laws that lie behind nature, and you can see it in the top right-hand picture, a series of mathematical ratios, proportions of simple numbers, 1 to 2, 2 to 3, 1 to 3, that sort of thing, and the sure perfection of the circle and the square. So the facade is controlled mathematically so that you can't move anything in it without altering or changing the whole. And you could just try it. Try making the columns a little bit broader. Try making the door a little bit higher. And you can see that if you change any one of those, the whole thing would have to change. So that's the first thing that he's doing. The second is he's trying to reconcile the form of the church, which has got this particular form of a nave and 2 aisles and so on, with the ancient classical forms of the triumphal arch and the temple front. And you can see the models down on the bottom. If you look at the facade, you can see that the temple front is kind of laid over the triumphal arch. And he's doing that because he's looking back again behind the present, behind the obvious everyday, to some idealized past in whose forms are held pure and everlasting ideas. The plan of the church is in the form of a cross, and over the square of the center of the cross is the sphere, the symbol of heaven. The cross obviously reflects the cross of Christ, and it also describes the human form made in the image of God, i.e. perfect, as the drawings of Francesco di Giorgio show, with the perfect man inscribed in the circle and the square. And lastly, in the cross form is a journey from the entry at the beginning in the secular world of the porch to the long passage of the nave to the great culmination under the heavenly dome, which in a certain sense represents the idea of a Christian life. So there are a number of very powerful objectives and beliefs that are tied into the design of the building. The idea of one God and his perfection, the idea of permanent truths and mathematics, the idea of wholeness, completion, immutability, the idea of a relation with the human body, and the conception of the sure process of human life, at least for believers. Italian architecture, and that of most of Europe, is drenched in these kind of ideas emanating from Greek and Judaic thinking. You could object that the Gothic tradition had a much looser aesthetic that enabled addition and change. However, in its height, in 13th century France, it was profoundly rational, and I think these photographs give some idea of that. It's based on very precise hierarchies of structural elements, from the church as a whole to one archway to the vault, and all the way down, almost like in a mathematical precision, all the way down to the smallest element in there. It's very, very tightly controlled, and in many of them also mathematically. So as an architectural method, if one could call it that, it was so powerful that when Palladio, the most influential architecture ever, designed a secular building, this is a Villa Malcontenta in the 16th century, he based it on proportional ratios derived from the laws of musical harmony as derived from Pythagoras' thinking centuries before. And when Giuseppe Terragni brought his Casa del Fascio in the 1930s to order, he did it with the proportions of the golden mean. Both believed they had imbued their buildings with the timeless truths that lay behind nature, and also in distinction to the nature that we experience, the one that grows and changes. Now, it's difficult to imagine, Japan, we made it. It's difficult to imagine anything more different from Alberti's church than a Japanese religious precinct such as this one, Kiyomizu-dera, in Kyoto, most of which was built around 1630. You can see that it's not a building at all, but a whole place of many different buildings that climb on stone stairs and walkways up a hillside towards a main building, which is the Hondo, which is up there in the forest. And as you go up, the buildings, you experience the buildings as variations of a theme, like a cluster of the same kind of plant seeded by a mother tree. And they seem to be spaced more or less as they would be by, say, a light wind blowing seeds across a rough surface. Having passed numerous gateways, treasuries, shrines, and bell towers, you arrive at the Hondo, and it's in the bottom left-hand corner. But unless you've been there before, it's something of a surprise that this is the main sanctuary. There's very little sense of hierarchy. You find yourself on a balcony overlooking a small valley and can see that the journey you've made to reach this climax actually carries on around the corner, where you can see other shrines and a pagoda. You can go there and experience or pray at them. The little Buddha figures on the left-hand corner are apparently the souls of children, lost children, so people who've got have lost a child would go and pray there. They also encompass the spring, which you can see on the bottom right-hand corner. And the spring was recognized by a priest called Enchen in about 780 AD as being the one of miraculous power which he had seen in a vision. He started the shrine around it, and the Otowazan Kiyomizu-dera, the clear water temple on Sound of Feathers Mountain, is named after it. When you get to the other side of the small valley, you can see the Hondo, sitting there over the forest on its great scaffold, all held together without any glue or nails or bolts or anything, all built of this great big timber scaffold, and you can see how many people there are standing on it. And a little bit further along, other buildings, a pagoda and other buildings overlooking the city of Kyoto. If you look at a plan of the place, it's like a fleeting moment in nature, the way that it's arranged. You could drop in another one of those roofs or take one away or blow a few away at any time without really making any difference to it, any conceptual idea difference to it anyway. Japanese culture is deeply rooted in a respect for nature that grows and changes. And I think the picture of this woman's intensity, this gardener, she's digging away in the ground, somehow shows that. And this surely has something to do with the geography of the place. There's a huge proportion of it is mountainous. Everywhere is close to the sea. Climatically, it's very varied, from sultry summers to snowy winters. Volcanoes and earthquakes, as you know, happen all the time. In fact, when we were there a couple of years ago in Tokyo, we driving along on the train, there was a little notice that came up saying, sorry, we're 3 minutes late, but there's been an earthquake over there, and so the train's been a little bit delayed. It's a very, very volatile place in nature terms. Nature forces itself on you, and it's very beautiful. It's a land of mountains and lakes and islands and beautiful varied forests with exquisite trees. Now, I have read a book quite recently that was lent to me that really decried what was happening with nature in Japan, or has happened over the last 20 or 30 years, that the forests, it's been terribly deforested, that the rivers have been lined with awful concrete bridges and so on. And it is true to say that a lot of Japan now is incredibly ugly. But the nature itself that traditional people experienced was really beautiful, and I hope these pictures give some sort of sense of it. The sort of wonderful richness of the plants there. Every tree seems to be like a perfect specimen. If you look at this forest, this is just on the outskirts of Kyoto. Just look at the complexity of that forest, the richness of that forest on the hill. It's hardly surprising that Japan's indigenous religion, Shintoism, is so closely interwoven with nature. The founding myth has a male and female character, Izanagi and Izanami, whose union produces the islands of Japan, the waters, the mountains, and the trees, and also a number of deities, the chief of whom is Amaterasu, the goddess of the sun. She, it was held, all the way up to the Second World War, was the ancestor of the imperial royal family, an idea which was very usefully spawned by some powerful clan. Now, there are three main ideas nurtured by Shinto which impact on the spatial environment. The first is this divine descent of Japan, its rulers and its people. Shintoism is a very Japanese religion. They're not talking about humankind, they're talking about Japanese people. And obviously that has difficult implications when it comes to a situation where of extreme nationalism, for instance. The second idea, which is the most important one in relation to what we're talking about really, is that the world is filled by kami, who are spiritual creatures who are engaged with human beings and can help them in their lives. And kami are in, or can be found in, any everything in nature, mountains, streams, trees, animals, human beings, and also in things like storms and earthquakes, and also in things that human beings have made. So everything, if you like, of the physical environment is potentially imbued with sacredness. So that's the second thing. The third, I think I've got a picture that goes with that. That is a sacred tree. The third thing is that it's really much more a way of life than a religion. And the idea is to follow the way of the kami. So rituals are very important, personal, daily rituals, and also bigger ones on special days and by special people. And the chief concern in all that seems to be purity, that spiritual purity and harmony. So a purifying ritual is a very important part of life. And I say is because, in fact, even today, if you go there, I'm not sure how many people have been there, whether you would agree, but you see a lot of, in all the shrine sites, you see this process of purification going on. So that's important, but also the aim is to achieve a kind of a moral purity. And you do that by living a life of sincerity and authenticity. And these words are important when we come to look at other categories of architecture. And also by avoiding things which disturb the kami, by aggravating the natural order, so you leave nature alone. So I can't imagine what the kami are doing now. Or by disrupting the harmony of the community. And I'm showing this photograph. This is in Osaka, and it's probably one of the busiest underground stations in the world. There are 18 million people in Osaka, and a lot of them go through the station, and they're all going to work. And to me, it shows the way that kind of respect for the community and avoidance of making any kind of disruption persists very powerfully to today. If that stream moves all at the same speed, nobody goes too fast or too slow, nobody bumps anybody else. If you're coming from the other direction, nobody bumps into you. If you get lost, somebody stops and tells you, oh, you can go there and there. But it's an unbelievably calm and controlled situation. My wife described it as like salmon going up a river for spawning. It's just like an incredibly calm and tranquil flow of these millions and millions of people. And I think that exemplifies that kind of harmony that there is in the community. So Japan's second major religion is Buddhism, which arrived from China via Korea in the 6th century and was soon working very harmoniously with Shinto, so that people used both and for different purposes. And in fact, a guide on one trip that I went many years ago said to us, in Japan, 3/4 of the people are Buddhist, 3/4 of them are Shinto, and at Christmas time, everybody's a Christian. Because they like getting presents. They also, incidentally, use Christianity for weddings. They like white Christian weddings. So there are a lot of hotels which have got little chapels attached to them for weddings by people who would call themselves Shintos or Buddhists. They're not Christians at all, but they're built around the form of the cross, and it's all set up just like a Christian church. So these two religions existed side by side, partly because Buddhism also is a practice rather than a religion, and partly because they share this wonderful reverence for nature. In Buddhism, and there must be Buddhists here or people who know about much more about Buddhism than I do, so if I'm talking nonsense, just say, you're talking nonsense. But my understanding is that in Buddhism there's a profound belief in the great unity among all things and beings of the universe. Indeed, what Buddhists seek, enlightenment, and is the full realization and experience of that unity beyond space and time. And within this unity, there's no hierarchy. There's no separation of human beings from animals and plants. Indeed, in a sense, enlightenment is being a bit more like an animal in the unity, uncluttered by all the thoughts and worries of daily existence and by the ego. And the practice of Buddhism is the pursuit of enlightenment, nirvana, and it's recognized that it's a long, long process. In fact, I've read that it's said that people like the historical Buddha only come every 32,000 years. So it's a very long process, and the process is cyclical and repetitive through many, many incarnations. Now, I know there are many different kinds of Buddhism who have different ideas about incarnation, but broadly speaking, there's this idea of a changing, moving, cyclical process. Like the movement of the heavenly bodies or of all organic phenomena. So what Buddhists do is keep seeking this enlightenment, principally through meditation, which involves constantly seeking renewal, getting rid of clutter, and looking for insights that cut across habitual ways of seeing and thinking. It's essentially a religion of change, like nature. It sits harmoniously also with Shinto in that it too hasn't any God. However, humans are assisted in their search for nirvana by spirits known as bodhisattvas, who are personages who've achieved a form of nirvana but stay on earth to fulfill this helping function. In Japan, they've become homologists with the kami and live side by side with them. This is a temple in Kyoto which has got 1,000 bodhisattvas all lined up. They move around the central one, that's this Kannon Guanyin, who's basically a kind of goddess of mercy. And you can see that she's got hundreds of arms, and around her you can see there are lots of other little, on her halo, there are lots of other little Buddha-like figures representing the thousands of eyes that she also has. So it's an all-seeing, all-encompassing goddess of mercy. With this kind of philosophical and religious background, it's not surprising that the shrines and temples and the houses and gardens and the whole human-made spatial environment were conceived as being part of and representative of the changing, growing, living, dying nature of experience. I'll just have a slug of water. Sorry. Excuse me a moment. How does this all become apparent? Firstly, buildings are ever changing. As we've seen, a religious precinct is made up of a group of buildings which, like fallen leaves, you could add or change anything easily without spoiling anything. And a single building, too, is designed in such a way that it can be freely altered. This is the Ninomaru Palace, which is a shogun's palace. I always like to think of this and compare it with the palazzi of the people in Florence, the great lords of Florence. It's such a modest kind of palace compared with theirs. And the shogun was the violent military ruler who, I was going to say lay behind the throne, but it's actually normally more in front of the throne. The emperor became a really minor figure. The shogun was the one that really ruled Japan. This is his palace. Now, if you just look at it as a single building, you can see immediately that it's organized in a very loose kind of a way, with a series of pavilions that connect with each other diagonally. It would be very easy to take one away or add another one without spoiling the whole. In fact, it looks rather as if it has grown over time, and there's no clear main pavilion And it doesn't seem to matter in the arrangement which one is the biggest. The entrance is at the bottom right, as you can see, and it's completely asymmetrical. And you move through the building in a kind of a zigzag along the edge, which the arrows indicate. The thin lines and dots that you can see in the pavilions are sliding partitions. So one space can be very easily connected to another. And if you like, the whole building could be opened up into one big space, or at least a whole series of visually connected spaces. So it's a building that is fundamentally built to change. In 3 dimensions, you can see this quite clearly. And in fact, this has got kitchens added on that wasn't in the previous diagram, but I'm sure it doesn't bother you at all. Just as the inner spaces can change, so too can the pavilions in relation to the garden. If you look in the bottom right-hand picture, on the left-hand side, there's a box. Can you see it there? A kind of wooden box. And the doors of that whole side of the building can be slid into this box, opening the interior into the beautiful garden, which is that. And that. So within this conception of a building being of nature, it's important to recognize that there's not really any theoretical difference between the inside and the outside. It's rather like a forest. You don't think of a forest having an inside and outside. There's some places that are more enclosing and others that are not, are less. And conceptually, that's the way that Japanese traditional architecture is thought about. They're part of the same continuity. So buildings like this Ninomaru Palace constantly bring the outside in, either by framing pieces of nature or by connecting visually and physically with it. This is actually another shogun's palace in another little city. Or by what they call shake, borrowing the distant landscape into the interior. It would certainly happen in a traditional house. And the house is probably the clearest example of a building changing or growing like nature. It's interesting, by the way, that there's a word for house, kariya, which essentially means rented overnight space. And another one, sukyo, which means temporary abode. So even in its conception, there's something impermanent. This is borne out by a report in a book that I read by a man called Bruno Taut, who was a well-known architect of the 1930s, who lived there for a long time, and who described a situation where he had people to dinner in his Japanese house. It got rather late, and so they simply pulled out an extra couple of futons, and they all slept happily together in the same space. So it was for the visitors merely a temporary abode. Oh, sorry. The house is basically a big roof, and this is, you can see a model of a very old kind of house. It's a big roof supported on a wooden framework, and under the roof it's very variable. And if you look in the little diagram on the top left-hand corner, it says Japanese concept, they're really sort of rooms. They're the names of rooms. And you can see, for instance, that the chanoma, you can work, you can eat and cook, and you can sleep, and so on. So there's this incredible multiple use that is possible in the rooms, which of course creates also an incredible saving in space. It's important to state, I think, now that I think a big difference between the Japanese tradition and the Italian tradition is that Japanese traditional buildings are primarily roof buildings. All the expression and so on, a lot of it comes from the way the roof is made, the way that it's supported, the sort of brackets that is done with the edge of it, the gables, the top of the ridges and everything. It's like very much about the roof, whereas the Italian tradition is much more kind of a wall tradition. All the expression. Sorry. Can you hear me? Okay. All the expression comes from the wall. You can see this variability in the plan. Tessa, will you stick it on my sorry, will you put it on my collar here? Is that okay? Okay, thanks. You can see this variability in the plan. The same sliding doors that there are between the spaces and between the house and the veranda and the garden. And you can see also that the floor is subdivided in a modular way, each module being a tatami mat, and we'll see some just now, which is about 1.8 by 0.9 meters, 6 foot by 3 foot, very good human size. And obviously this modularity is an aid to the flexibility and movability of the house because you can interchange one element with another. So here we have a typical house interior. You can see the tatami mats, the interior solid doors, which they call fusama, which you can slide, and then the shoji, which are the paper-covered ones in the background. The glass is obviously a more recent thing. So the shoji in the background and the soft light that comes through that. And they all slide between the floor and this beam called the nageshi beam. So you can just move that space around in any way that you want to. And there's the ease of connection inside is obviously matched by the connection with the outside. So in the top left you can see that incredible ease of just opening up to the outside. The right-hand one gives some sense of the kind of lovely soft light that comes through those paper screens. The bottom left is a very old house, and you can see it doesn't have these tatami mats. So presumably they slept on some sort of mat that they simply put there for the night. And on the right, I've called it the floor is furniture. It's basically, in principle, there's no furniture. The floor is the furniture. You live on the floor. And it's actually a wonderful thing to sit on the floor and feel the scale of it, because that nageshi beam is quite low. It would hit me about here. So it's quite low. So, and you can see why, because when you sit on the floor, everything seems to fall into place in the right way. This shows the way that it works. You have a room with these big, deep cupboards. So they've got these very flexible rooms or spaces, and deep cupboards where you store bits and pieces of furniture you might need and your bedding. So they'll simply pull that out, lay it down, and you go to sleep, push it back, and you could have a party there that evening in the same space. You can see in the right-hand one, there's a bed and there's a workspace right next to it. And then in the left-hand picture, and left and right, it's sort of the main room of the house, where they have what's called this tokonoma, which it's like one of those deep cupboards, but it's not a cupboard. It's a space for, it's a kind of a family shrine, where they have a solid wall for beautiful pictures, and shelving for flower arrangements and and lovely bowls and things. Okay, so that's the first part of it, the house moving and changing and shifting like nature. The second association between architecture and nature is that if there's this unity between all things in nature and all natural things are venerated, the old and fading get the same respect as the young and freshly growing. It's very affirming for old people, because wrinkles, bumps, and warts are fine. Beauty isn't some perfect, ideal thing that is seen as something to aspire to and to keep as long as possible in kind of eternal youth. So you see ancient trees that are propped up and patched. Flowers curling and drying with age are kept, but patina and the rough growths are treated with respect. There's beauty in them, but also something sad, a sense of the inevitability in nature of things passing. They call it mono no ware. It's an aesthetic notion which describes the sense of the transience of life that evokes a kind of melancholy, a kind of bittersweet beauty. You can see something of this in the Gold Pavilion, or what is known as the Gold Pavilion, the Kikankuji in Kyoto. It's a temple now, but it began as a pleasure villa for a shogun. But when he died at the beginning of the 15th century, his grandson converted it into a Zen temple. And it lies like this kind of exquisite bird in a perfect garden at the edge of the pool. And as you approach it, its fresh beauty lures you with every step. And when you arrive at it, you find it indeed exquisite in every detail. Now, as you move past it, and remember, the outside is as much part of the design of the place as the inside of the building, you come across things which conjure up different impressions, like this dry watercourse and a bank with a twisted tree and its roots exposed and rocks that look a bit like old bones. And then just as you start to lose sight of the pavilion, you come across a small cabin. It's a tea house with all kinds of things growing and deteriorating on the roof. Not what you would call exquisite, but very real, authentic, and with a touch of mono no ware, of sadness, things passing. And if you look closely at this tea house, you can see that it's built of the simplest raw timber and with different sizes and profiles of all kinds, and also with saplings. It's very unpretentious. Apart from the moss and bare patches on the roof, the wood carries a patina of age, and so do the unpainted plaster walls. And then just nearby, there's this very strange small shelter made of rough, untreated bamboo and timber, including bent pieces of branch. Now, what you're experiencing here is what they call Wabi-Sabi, which is an allied aesthetic category which was developed under Zen Buddhism. Sabi is about the appreciation of patina and loneliness. It's a kind of basic rustic modesty and economy of means. And wabi is also about loneliness, but connected with poverty. And it's something that values independence from worldly goods. So these two came together to mean the beauty of things impermanent and imperfect, of things growing and dying. And its principles are, and I mean, they're strange categories if you think of them for categories of beauty. Weathering, unpretentiousness, small things being profound, freedom from convention, and asymmetry. Asymmetry, of course, is very characteristic of nature, and it's very consistent in Japanese architecture. Things are laid out according to the vagaries of the site and the movement of people, not according to any kind of rational idea. So if you look at this temple site, although each of the buildings has got a certain symmetry in itself. The way that it's laid out is completely asymmetrical. Look at the asymmetry that there is in these paths. They seem to follow much more the way that people move or where trees are and things like that, rather than there being any kind of overriding idea. And the slightly bent pathway is very typical. And then in the top right-hand corner, a little shrine on an island near Osaka. It's a completely asymmetrical design. There's nothing that's symmetrical there. It looks like something that's grown over a period of time. Okay, the fourth major way in which traditional buildings work with nature is simply in their harmony with it. They're not set up in distinction to nature, as in the Western classical tradition, but as indistinct from it. So firstly, they're very site-specific. In other words, they belong to a specific site and exploit its particular features and connections. And this is 4 different shrine sites just on the edge of Kyoto and quite close to each other, and each one seems to settle into its own space in a very particular way for that space, that place. Horizontality. Japanese buildings are dominated by the horizontal. They lie parallel to the earth, harmoniously with it, and hence with a very powerful sense of tranquility. One is constantly aware of the horizontal plane of the earth, of the floor parallel to that, and of the wide horizontality of the roofs and their great eaves. Thirdly, when you look at the construction of the house, you can see that it's also kindly to the nature in the sense that it touches the earth lightly. It's made of very small structural members, and you can see that in the. I hope you can see it if you're not an architect. In the drawing on the top left, they're very small, thin members that build it up, and the external enclosing fabric of it, of paper and timber, is also very thin and very light. And even when they have solid walls, like those walls, they're actually basically a kind of a wattle and daub made with rice fibers and plastered in a very sophisticated way with a kind of a clay finish. And then on top of that, you have this great roof with its wide eaves. Note that it's all post and beam construction. This isn't particularly important for now, but it becomes more important later. It's called trabeation. So you have a whole series of posts and lintels or beams that go across the top of it. Even in the roof structure, as you can see on the bottom right-hand side, where it would have been much more economical, in fact, to use diagonal struts, it would have made it more efficient. So we'll talk a bit more about that later. Now, this form of construction works very well in hot, humid climates. So you can imagine it sheds this rain that pours down very easily. It creates big shaded areas around the building. It doesn't store any heat because the fabric of the building is so thin that it can't store any heat. And it picks up all the breezes because you can open it up right through and it's hollow underneath. So it's a wonderful form of building for a very hot climate. But can you imagine it in winter? This is a lousy picture, I'm afraid, but I haven't been there in winter. It's the best that I could get off the net. Well, these are obviously glass walls, but imagine them being paper walls. How cold it would be inside there. The same man, Bruno Taut, said that when it was in wintertime, they simply wore the same inside the building as they did outside. And they spent a lot of time around little braziers that they had on the inside of the building, cuddling up with each other to keep warm. Now, you could argue that it's because there's all this timber in Japan, but there's also a lot of stone in Japan. And there's a lot of evidence that they knew exactly how to build with stone buildings, and they also lasted very well in earthquakes, which is the other argument about the timber buildings there, that they did that so that they could move around when there was an earthquake. But in fact, their stone buildings survived extremely well in earthquakes too. So the reason that they were built like this was a cultural one, because the building was conceived as a living, changing part of nature. And that's the end for today. Thank you very much. There is 5 minutes if you want to ask a couple of questions. Well, the question is whether they drew plans or not. From what I've heard, is if you wanted a house, traditional house, you simply said to the master, they were always men, some use the word master, a master builder, you simply said, I want a 25 tatami house. And they would make a little sketch and show it to you, and that would be it, you know. So after that, there's an incredible tradition of skill. So, you know, once you established that and you had all these basic components, you knew how it worked, the only thing that had to be separate from the house a bit was the loo. But then apparently Japanese people are not so fussed about smells from loos and things like we are. So you know, it was really quite easy to put a house together. Yeah, traditional house.
Do they still put those traditional houses together? I noticed they had very much block of land, like we have.
Yeah, I'll talk more about that later in the week. But the people do still inhabit some of them in some places and in rural areas, and in places like inns. They have traditional inns where you can stay, and they are just like that. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.